this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Joining me today on The Conversation is Douglas Stone. Doug is the founder of Triad Consulting and a lecturer at Harvard Law School, where he teaches negotiation. He's also the co-author of the books Thanks for the Feedback, The Science and Art of Receiving Feedback Well, and Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most. Doug, thanks for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. Let me start with a couple sentences from the foreword of your book, Difficult Conversations. You say the Harvard method, as it's sometimes called, emphasizes the importance of easy two-way communication. Yet in both negotiations and daily life, for good reasons or bad, we often don't talk to each other and don't want to. And sometimes when we do talk, things only get worse. Feelings, anger, guilt, hurt escalate. We become more and more sure that we are right, and so do those with whom we disagree. And this is the realm of difficult conversations. So I really thought that this was the perfect topic for our current times, because clearly the way I like to think of it is people have entrenched themselves, and rather than having dialogue, they're just hurling insults back and forth. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation with you about how to deal with difficult conversations.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you frame it that way, partly in terms of the sort of political moment that we're in. And I don't just mean the election, but the one that we've been in for a long time, relating to how we communicate on social media and regular media and with each other. One of the more interesting dynamics I've heard in the last 4 or 5 years is people saying, we've been in our own communication bubble for so long. We really need to reach out. We need to understand people who see things differently from how we see them. And I'm always thinking, yeah, absolutely right. And then I'll say, so how about reaching out to this person? And they'll say, oh, no, that person's too much. They're totally on the other side. I can't talk to that person. They're evil or they're whatever. And you sort of go through and you list every person that they might benefit from talking to. And they're saying, I'll talk to anybody but those really difficult people. One of the challenges is being open to talking to people who, as we said in the forward there, people you may not want to talk to, or people who may not want to talk to you. But often those are the people you can learn the most from. And in any event, I think it's crucial, at least in the United States in the upcoming months and years, that people have relations, if not friendships, at least relationships across the aisle, whether you're in Congress or just living your life out in the community.
Yeah, I think I can't remember, I'm getting the names wrong because I'm not a political guy, but there was like a person that was heavy in the Democratic Party, like a publicist or a promoter or something, and then he married someone that was his equal, but on the Republican side. So it was just, you can definitely do it. And I know personally, in my social media feeds, there are people that I will often read their post and think to myself, I need to just unfollow or mute this person. Then I say, no, I need to hear this other side of the story, because the answer probably is somewhere between the two of us. Neither one of us is probably right or wrong. It's somewhere in the middle. And so I forced myself to listen to the other side, because I do want to be more rounded and open.
Yeah, well, that's great. I think that's terrific. And it helps you, right? It's probably good for the people you're in touch with, but also it just makes you better at your work to know not just what the fans are saying, but the people who are on the other side, or the critics or the haters, whoever they are. It's useful to know where they're coming from, to try to understand them to the extent that makes sense, to learn whatever you can from them and about them. That doesn't mean that you necessarily have to agree with them in any way.
Right.
You can be in as much disagreement as you were before, but at least now you understand what it is they're trying to say.
Yeah, I really feel like we're kindred spirits. We kind of both understand the importance of having a conversation. I was wondering, how did you become passionate about this topic?
So I was a student at Harvard Law School and studying law, and I was lucky enough to take a course on negotiation with Professor Roger Fisher, who was one of the kind of founders of the negotiation field. And he was the one that taught me that we tend to think of negotiation as just a skill that you're good at or that you're not good at. and it's something you're born with. So how can you take a course in it? What is it that's going to help? And Roger really believes that people may come into it with different aptitudes, but if you study it systematically and practice it systematically, wherever you started, you can get much better. And so I was exposed to that in law school and became passionate about the whole field of negotiation and conflict resolution. And then my colleagues and I started to notice that a lot of what we were learning in negotiation was this kind of arm's length transactional kind of communication, which makes sense. Like, an example is if you're buying a car or you're negotiating an arms limitations deal. Those are pretty iconic negotiation dynamics going on. And there had been a lot of good work and thinking around sort of how to do that well. But my colleagues and I noticed that there really wasn't much out there for things that had some conflict in them, but it wasn't clear that they were a negotiation or they weren't sort of necessarily about money or, how much is the car going to cost. We started noticing that there's this whole category of just people sort of wanting to talk about difficult things. So at work, for example, if you're wondering, so why did they get that project and not me? Or why was my bonus lower this year when I had a better year than last year? Those sort of have the characteristics to some extent of a negotiation, but really they're kind of at their heart, they're interpersonal relationship challenges. And so we thought that we would do the same kind of work that people had been doing on negotiation around those kinds of challenges, the kind of conflicts that people have in their everyday lives, whether it's with a spouse or a child, with a business partner or a colleague or a supervisor.
Well, as I read the book, I will admit there were several stories throughout that certainly resonated with me, and I felt like you wrote them about me. So I appreciate the book for sure. One of the things you said was that tact is good, but it's not the answer to difficult conversations. And then you go on to say that delivering a difficult message is like throwing a hand grenade. Whether coated with sugar, thrown hard or soft, a hand grenade is still going to do damage. Now, by the way, one of my favorite movies that I watched with my son is Big Hero 6. And in that, there's a heroine who throws these pink hand grenades that do a lot of damage, but they're really pretty hand grenades, right? So how do we avoid throwing the pretty pink grenades?
Great question. So I think a lot of us, when we're confronted with a difficult conversation, our first instinct is to think, well, should I be sort of tough or should I be really friendly? And that's worth thinking about. But neither of those, there's no answer on that particular continuum between sort of being tough and being nice that is going to make the difficult conversation go away. So that's a pretty limited way of thinking about it. Just like if I'm nice enough, when I fire this person, they'll think that I handled it really well, or they'll still like me. First of all, a good outcome of a difficult conversation isn't that everybody feels happy or better than before, or that you feel happy or relaxed. Those are good things. But a good outcome is really related to the question, did we talk about the important things that are on the table for us to talk about? We can sort of talk about them generously and thoughtfully, but we're not the purpose of engaging in a tough conversation isn't to just check the box and then sweep the conversation under the rug. The real test is, did you say what you wanted to say? Did you expose the problem that you wanted to expose? And are you engaging? Are you talking well about that set of issues?
So what is the underlying structure of every difficult conversation?
When we first wrote the book, Difficult Conversations, the original title was The 10 Hardest Things to Say and How to Say Them. And people really liked that title because people like lists and so forth. And we started writing it that way. And so we'd have a chapter on, saying I'm sorry, or a chapter on asking for a raise. And what we found was that we were putting all the same observations and advice in each chapter. We asked ourselves, well, why is it that we keep coming up with the same advice, no matter what the topic of the conversation is? And what we noticed was that regardless of the substance of the conversation, so it could be about asking for a raise, or it could be about putting your infant child to sleep at night, or the conversations you have with your spouse about that. Regardless of the substance, all conversations kind of have the same challenges embedded in them. And the three kind of streams, or what we call the three conversations in each conversation, are the substance. So part of the conversation is obviously going to be about the topic that we're talking about, and there's some better and worse ways to do that. A second level of a conversation is going to be the level of emotions, right? People have feelings, and especially we have feelings. If a conversation feels difficult, there's going to be strong feelings for me or for you or possibly for both of us. So we have to think about what's the role that feelings play. And then the third level, in some ways, was the least obvious to us anyway. And that's what we call the identity conversation. So if a conversation feels challenging to you, whether it's incredibly big and important or small, our assertion is that there's some way that that conversation has the potential to challenge how you see yourself. And it can be sort of in a paradoxical way. If let's say I'm a supervisor and I'm giving my employee some negative feedback, and you'd think, well, this conversation is probably hard for the employee. They're getting some negative feedback, and maybe their identity is implicated in the sense that they think of themselves as a good worker. And now I'm giving them feedback that suggests maybe they're not a good worker, and that might be hard to hear. But as the supervisor, my identity might be implicated as well, even though the topic of the conversation is really me giving my employee feedback. I might see myself as sort of a good, caring person who doesn't hurt other people. And now I'm in a position where I am hurting this person. I'm giving them negative feedback and they're upset by it. So the feedback to me in the conversation might be that I'm not sort of living up to my own standards for how I see myself. And that's common in a difficult conversation. We're often receiving feedback, and it may not be direct, but just sort of implicit in the conversation. We're receiving feedback that kind of flips our sense of how we see ourselves, what's important about who we are in the world. And so all three of those levels are happening: the substance, the emotion, and the identity. Those are all kind of swirling around together in a challenging conversation. And that's just one more reason that they're difficult.
I did like the first title for the book, though, but I see why you changed it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the truth assumption, where I am right and you are wrong. You say in the book that in reality, difficult conversations are almost never about getting the facts right. They're about conflicting perceptions, interpretations, and values. They're about what is true and important. Can you elaborate a little on that?
So this is a huge thing in difficult conversations. If you ask a room full of people, when you engage in a difficult conversation, raise your hand if you're the one who's right. Well, obviously, everybody in the room raises their hand. No one. I'm the one who's wrong. You must be the one who's right. So we all think that we're right, including the people that we're having a conversation with and who think the opposite of what we think. It's not because we just happen to be the person who's right in our lives, and then everybody else in the world is just filled with errors and mistakes and so forth. It's because the way the world looks to us when we look out on the world, we know, and we believe what we believe, and we have lots of information and reasons to think that. So we're not coming in thinking we're right because we're trying to get an advantage. We're thinking we're right because we really believe that we're right. The challenge with that is that so many of the topics that we have difficult conversations around are not topics that you can be, quote, right or wrong about. So if your workplace or your team is trying to make decisions about how to help people who are working from home who also have small children, and you're thinking, well, I work from home and I don't have small children, and this plan that we've come up with is going to penalize me, and so it's not fair. And so you start engaging from the point of view of, this is wrong, I'm right, and this plan is wrong. But if you step back and think about it, a plan for helping parents work from home who have kids isn't something that you can be, quote, right or wrong about. It's something that you can have an opinion about, you can have some views about, but you're not going to get anywhere if you're in the frame of, I'm right, you're wrong. That frame leads you to be in the conversation in a certain way. Namely, we end up sort of telling people, we end up simply asserting our point of view, and we give our thoughts and reasons, and we're not curious at all about what's going on with the other side. And why should we be? Because we already know that they're wrong.
Which brings us to 2020 in a capsule. Yeah. That's it right there, right? We're in our bubble saying I'm right, you're wrong, and not really listening to the other side. So
I'm one of the few people that I know who I try to watch a range of news channels, partly to be informed and partly, I actually genuinely believe, like, aside leaving politics out of it, I think I'm actually getting a better picture of the world from watching all of them than from watching any one of them.
I agree. I think that you have your channels that are kind of in one camp or the other, and the answer is usually somewhere in between. So I think it's good to get both sides of the story and kind of figure out for yourself where the answer probably more likely lies.
Right.
As I read the book, I kept pulling these truisms out that really resonated with me. One is that when competent, sensible people do something stupid, the smartest move is to try to figure out first what kept them from seeing it coming, and second, how to prevent the problem from happening again. To me, that was such a powerful statement. That really resonated with me.
Yeah. When something goes wrong, it's just a very common human reaction to sort of look around and point the finger at somebody else. Again, it's not based in malice. It's not that we're trying to get other people in trouble. It's just kind of the way our brain works. And so when something goes wrong, the easiest thing is like, well, I was working on this project with my colleague here, and the reason things went wrong was he made some mistakes. The better way to think about that whole question is, if we're working on a project and we didn't do a great job, you want to ask, the purpose isn't to figure out, well, so who should we punish here? But at the end of the day, you figured out, okay, so that person got punished. That doesn't really help anything. The real thing that we all want, we want to understand what led to this problem in a complex way. And then we want to ask, how can we fix it going forward? How can we make sure it doesn't happen again? And if my colleague and I turned in some work that wasn't as good as it should have been, probably both of us contributed to that. And we want to understand, what did you contribute to that problem? What did I contribute? What did our supervisor may have contributed something to it by not giving us certain information, whatever it is. But you want to sort of get out of that knee-jerk mindset of, well, if something went wrong, it was this person's fault. And instead, even if you're the boss, even if you're in charge, you want to take a moment and step back and say, if something goes wrong, it's my assumption that we've all done something that was less than great. And we want to understand what we each did and then what we can each do to make it better next time.
You also say that difficult conversations don't just involve feelings, but they are at their very core about feelings. But most of us prefer to avoid that topic either to save time or decrease our anxieties. Is that a mistake?
Well, it depends, right? It depends. I mean, all of these things depend on the circumstances. So you don't want to be someone, let's say you're in a workplace, back when we had offices. You don't want to be someone who gets the reputation of like, that person just whines all the time, or they're always in a bad mood. So it's not about your mood, right? If someone says, hey, can you get me that memo by the end of the day? You don't want to say, well, today's not a good memo day for me. I'm feeling kind of sad. And, I just need to kind of process my feelings for the next 7 hours. And then maybe tomorrow will be a better memo day for me. So that, of course, would be nutty. So we're not saying just tell everyone every moment, broadcast what your mood is, like a weather report. Instead, we're saying, as you confront challenges at work, so the question of who gets credit if you're working on a team, and you feel like, well, this is a 5-person team, but this particular project was my idea from start to finish, and you feel sort of frustrated and maybe unfairly treated if either someone else is getting credit for it or if the whole team is getting credit and you're not acknowledged. If you're not willing to kind of talk about the underlying feelings there, then you're going to talk about it in a very antiseptic way that might lead people just to not really understand what the challenge is. Sometimes we sort of hide our feelings about something by talking through the substance in as much detail as we can, but it never gets to the heart of it, which might just be, it just doesn't feel fair to me. I'm not saying we should do it differently next time. I'm just letting you know it doesn't feel fair. And that can save a lot of time. That can get right to the heart of things. And when feelings are motivating the challenge, it's really hard to kind of engage well without naming that and making it specific.
Another great comment regarding the identity conversation was that it's all about who we are and how we see ourselves. It's really about what I'm saying to myself about me. Can you expand on that?
Yeah. So this is something I really learned about as we were writing the book, just the way that we see ourselves in the world. Before we wrote the book, I would have said, well, you're just sort of the totality in any given moment. When you think sort of, who am I? You sort of think about your whole life and it all adds up into who you are now. And there's a million, billion, trillion moments that went into it. But in fact, that's not how we see ourselves or do the math about who we are. Basically, what we do is we have a few core values or ideas about who we are, and those kind of guide us, and those help us feel good about ourselves. So the positive ones anyway. So if I have a self-image, as I said in an earlier example, if I'm the kind of person who doesn't hurt other people, if I'm a colleague of yours, it's going to be good for you because you're going to like me and you're going to get good coaching, and I'm just going to be a positive in your life. And then I have to give you negative feedback, and I'm now a negative in your life, or at least at the moment I am. That might throw me off balance, and it has nothing to do really with the substance of the conversation. It just has to do with how I'm seeing myself as a result of the conversation. And a very common thing that we do is we treat it as sort of binary, or as a black and white question. So if I see myself as a person who doesn't hurt other people, I'm either a person who never hurts other people and is scrupulously thoughtful and careful, or I might be a person who doesn't seem to care about other people and hurts them all the time. And if those are my only two choices, it's going to be impossible to land anywhere and feel sturdy about it, because you can't be one thing all the time. Even the most generous, thoughtful, caring people make mistakes, and they're selfish sometimes. So one of the things that we have to do around our identity is really open up our awareness of sort of not just our strengths, but our legitimate weaknesses, and how to think from and move from our strengths and while being aware of and trying to correct our weaknesses. And so if we get feedback in a challenging conversation that we're not being thoughtful or caring, we want to take that in. We want to try to understand it, but we don't want to exaggerate it into, therefore, I'm a terrible person and everything I've ever done has been terrible.
Yeah, so let's dig a little deeper into that. You said that rather than using the conversation to deliver a message, we should have a learning conversation instead. What does that mean?
I think that when we tend to think about engaging in a conversation, to the extent we prepare for it, often we just don't. But even if we do, the thing that we prepare is, so what will I say? How will I tell them that this is a concern of mine? That's just preparing us to go in and say, okay, I've got the courage, I've mustered up the courage. Here's my message. I think we should get the same bonus system as last year. And you sort of deliver the message, and now you feel like, okay, good, I did it. But that's really not how to have an effective conversation. It's much better to think of the engagement in the conversation as what we call a learning conversation, which reminds us that no matter how much you see it as, well, I just need to make my statement here. Conversation is always going to be two-way. The other side's always going to have a different point of view from you. Engaging well doesn't just mean stating your point of view well. It also means listening well and framing the conversation well. That's something that most of us wouldn't think about without sort of stepping back and really giving it some thought. But there's better and worse ways to start a conversation. The phrase learning conversation, I think, is just a good, helpful label for kind of remembering that it's two-way and that there are going to be some skills beyond just me asserting how I see things.
Yeah, I think most people today, well, I shouldn't say most, a lot of people today have a misinformed definition of conversation. It's not a conversation if you only use your mouth. You have to listen to the other side. And if you're just hurling insults back and forth, and if the other party's not agreeing with you, you just yell louder, then you're not really having a conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Well put. There's this idea that a quote, great communicator is someone who gives great speeches or, moves people with their use of words. And that's certainly true to the extent that you're thinking of it that way. There's lots of great communicators who are great orators or great speech makers. But in general, in the course of our lives, great communicators are people who have the courage to share how they're seeing things, and also have the wisdom to sort of step back and realize that it's going to be at least as important for me to hear how the other person is seeing this.
Yeah, I was born and raised in the South, and we have a saying down here that says you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that's the ratio. You should use them.
Yeah, I must have heard that growing. So I grew up in New York, but my mom's from Alabama, so I'm sure I got all of it.
Another thing you said, and by the way, I wish I'd read Difficult Conversations before I finished my last book because I would have quoted you so many times. But you said that to get anywhere in a disagreement, we need to understand the other person's story well enough to see how their conclusions make sense within it. And I think this is so important because I don't necessarily need to agree with you. I just need to understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, exactly. We do an exercise sometimes in my classes where we'll put out a controversial topic and the people are supposed to share their perspective on it. How do they see it? So one person starts, but then starting with the second person, they can only share how they see it once they've described how the person who went before them sees it to the satisfaction of that person. So person number two has to start by saying, here's how person number one sees it. And then at the end of that, person number one has to say, yes, that's right. And two interesting things of note. The exercise almost never gets past that first one because it turns out to be so frustrating. The person who's doing the paraphrasing thinks they're doing a great job, but the person who spoke first is constantly saying, no, that's not what I said. That's not how I see it. And eventually the person who wants to speak second and is trying to paraphrase the first person just inevitably says, you know what? I don't care how you see it. I just know that it's wrong. And I see it differently. And then we sort of pause. The person literally will say that. They'll say, maybe I don't understand how you see it, but it's wrong. And that really sums up the way that we communicate just in all sorts of situations.
All right. So talk a little bit about the and stance.
Yeah. So this, particularly in our social media world, is a real challenge. And I think also a really helpful concept. So the and stance, and it's the word A and D, and then the word stance, basically says that you can think two things at the same time. And those two things could be different. Like you can feel two things or more than two things at the same time. So you can think to yourself, oh, you know what? You're making a good point and I'm making a good point, right? You don't have to choose between those two things. Or you can think to yourself, I really appreciate what you're saying and I'm really hurt by it. Those two things can be true at the same time. It's a way of validating just the complexity of what's going on. If the other person says something that you agree with, you don't have to say, well, no, that's wrong just because there's some other things that you disagree with them about. So you're looking for things that seem true on their end, but also recognizing that there's going to be things that are true on your end. And you're looking for emotions to share that may not be sort of commonly paired, but which give the other person a better sense of sort of where you're really coming from. And you do it with the word and. So you might say, I appreciate the courage that it took you to raise this, and I'm surprised about your point of view. It's so different from what I was imagining. And on social media, of course, it's really hard to do that. It's hard to hear any kind of nuance or complexity to anything. And I certainly don't have the answer for all of that, but I do think this concept of the and stance can be useful. Just recognizing that sometimes things are complicated and we can talk about them in a way that's complicated. It doesn't all have to be drained of nuance.
Right. So it's not necessarily that it's black and it's white. It's you recognize the other party has a statement and a feeling, and you're recognizing that, giving it some validity.
Yeah, and we see this, sort of writ large, without getting into the politics of it, with some of the social justice causes where people are saying, either Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter, and you can't think both of those at the same time, or certainly you can think it, but if you say it, then you say Black Lives Matter, then you're somehow assumed to not care about the police. If you say Blue Lives Matter, you're assumed to not care about the well-being of Black people. And so what if you care about the well-being of both? There isn't a good way to say that at the moment. That has a function, right? It makes the conversation simpler, and it lets everybody know kind of, well, are you in that group or are you in that group? And some people are in each of those groups, but what if you're not? Or what if you feel like you're in both groups? Or what if you respect people in both groups? So it just gets difficult to share how you see the world when the kind of template, the social media template is structured into this, you have choice A or choice B, and that's it.
Yeah, it's binary as opposed to being a continuum.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, let's take a break from our discussion of difficult conversations. Coming up in part 2 of my interview with Douglas Stone, the founder of Triad Consulting and a lecturer at Harvard Law School, Doug has some advice for avoiding awkward conversations at holiday get-togethers.
I don't think you can go too far wrong by just whatever the differences are, whether they're political differences or just personal challenges with each other. Just remember that they're a person too. They're going through all the same kinds of life challenges that you're going through. And they have their perspective, and their perspective makes sense to them.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.